Hello guys, welcome to a new chapter of Empress Dowager Cixi. Virgin Journeys to the West, 1861 to 1871. On the road to modernity, Cixi had a kindred spirit, close advisor and dependable administrator in Prince Gong. Her decisions were formulated with the help of the prince, who then implemented them. Between them, the yellow silk screen barely existed. Without such a man outside the confines of the harem, Cixi could not have ruled effectively. She showed the price of her appreciation by awarding him unparalleled honors, and crucially, exempting him from having to prostrate before her. An imperial edict issued just after her coup in the name of her son specifically granted the privilege of not kneeling and kowtowing in everyday meetings to Prince Gong, together with Prince Chung and 3 other uncles of the child emperor. Prince Gong was the main beneficiary, as he saw Cixi every day. It eventually struck her that she really must withdraw this favor. Without the rigid etiquette, she realized, Prince Gong was too relaxed with her and was treating her in the patronizing way he tended to treat all women, especially as she was young, still in her 20s. His behavior irritated and angered her for some time, until one day in 1865, she exploded and in tremendous agitation fired him. She wrote a decree by hand, accusing him of having too high an opinion of himself, strutting about and giving himself airs, and simply being full of rubbish. This was one of the few decrees that Cixi wrote in her own hand. Her writing was still poor, and her text was littered with solecisms. That she threw caution to the winds and exposed her vulnerability, her lack of scholarship, which matters so much to the elite, shows how furious she was. Like most rocky moments in solid relationships, the storm passed. The grandees mediated. Cixi calmed down and Prince Gong apologized, prostrating at her feet, which remained behind the yellow silk screen, weeping and promising to reform his manners. Having made her point, Cixi rescinded her decree and restored Prince Gong to his former posts. She did, however, take away his title, Grand Advisor, although his role continued as before. She also told him to be deferential in court and stop behaving arrogantly. From now on, Prince Gong, tamed, took care to humble himself and to kneel and kowtow in her presence. This episode served as a warning to other grandees around her that Cixi was not to be patronizing. She was the master and they were all to prostrate before her. Her working relationship with Prince Gong remained close. In fact, they grew closer as they were thrown together as comrades, facing conservative opposition to their efforts to bring the empire into the modern age. One major episode concerned the first modern educational institution, Tongan College, the School of Combined Learning. It was set up in 1862, soon after Cixi's reign began, to train interpreters. At the time, it met with relatively little resistance. After all, China had dealt with foreigners. The school was housed in a picturesque mansion where, amidst date trees and groves of lilac and winter jasmine, a little bell tower announced the class hours. Then in 1865, when on Prince Gong's advice, Cixi decided to turn it into a fully fledged college teaching sciences, the opposition became frenzied. For 2000 years, only the classics had been regarded as a fit subject for education. Cixi defended her decision by saying that the college only intended to borrow Western methods to verify Chinese ideas, and would not replace the teachings of our sacred sages. But this did not assuage the officials who had risen to their present oppositions through imbibing Confucian classics, and they attacked the Foreign Office and Prince Gong as stooges of foreign devils. Graffiti abusing the prince were pasted on city walls. One source of outrage was that in this college, foreigners would be made teachers. By tradition, a teacher was a most revered figure, a mentor for life, who imparted wisdom as well as knowledge, and who must be respected like a parent. The murder of a teacher was classified as parricide, which, like treason, was punishable by death of 1,000 cuts. Emperors and princes set up shrines in their homes to honor the deceased tutors. The most vocal opponent on this issue was a highly esteemed Mongol scholar, Warren, a tutor of Cixi's childhood, Emperor Cixi. He wrote to Cixi arguing the Westerners must not be accorded their exalted status, as they were enemies who had invaded our country, threatened our dynasty, burned our palaces and killed our people. And he reasoned, "Today we are learning their secrets in order to fight them in future wars, and how can we trust them not to play evil tricks through fake teaching?" While rebuking the abusive dissenters with strong words, Cixi was gentle with Warren, merely bidding him to find Chinese teachers to teach sciences. This put the Mongol tutor on the spot, and he had to concede that he had no one to nominate. Cixi told him to keep trying and come up with a solution to the country's problems. The tutor, who had been selected to teach the emperor on account of his deep-rooted Confucian principles, was convinced of his own arguments, but he felt helpless and distraught in the face of reality. One day he burst into sobs while giving a lesson to the 9-year-old child emperor, who, having never seen the elderly teacher cry, was frightened and disconcerted. A few days later, the old man passed out while trying to mount a horse. He was ill and asked to resign. Cixi declined to accept his resignation but gave him permanent sick leave. Warren left behind many sympathizers at the court, including his fellow tutor, Grand Tutor Wang, also a hater of the West. Wang had wept when the old summer palace was burned down and called the Westerners in Beijing dirty animals and wolves and jackals. Cixi pushed ahead in spite of tenacious opposition and appointed a senior official, Hu Shiye, to head the college, announcing that Xu had high prestige and was a good model for the students. Hu's distinction in the Empress Dowager's eyes came from his book, the first comprehensive description of the world by a Chinese. Although he had never been abroad, Xu had been accomplished this major work with the help of an American missionary, David Abil, with whom he had been friends while working on the southern coast in the 1840s. In the book, he placed China as just one country among many on earth, contradicting the notion that China was the Middle Kingdom and the center of the world. America seems to be the country he admired most, and he said of George Washington, "What a hero." Xu wrote that after Washington fought victorious wars over a vast territory and people wanted to make him king, he did not ascend the throne nor pass his position to his descendants. Instead, he created a system by which a person became the head of the country through election. Washington was an extraordinary man, he claimed. As a side note, Xu's words about Washington are engraved on a memorial stone in the Washington Memorial Monument in Washington, D.C. Xu was most impressed by the fact that America had no royalty or nobles. In this brand new state, public affairs are decided by the people. What a wonder! To Xu, America came closest to the Confucian ideal that everything under heaven is for the people, Tian Xia Wei Gong, and was the place most familiar to China's three great ancient dynasties under the emperors Shun, Yao and Yu, more than 4,000 years earlier. Under these dynasties, the Chinese believed, their country was a flourishing and kind place, where the emperors were voted into office on merit and lived like everyone else. These dynasties were in fact mythical, but people imagined they were real, and quite a few Chinese who came into contact with the West expressed astonishment that China's legendary ancient practice appeared to be alive beyond the ocean. The British justice system was just like the one in our three great ancient dynasties, one observed. When Xu's book was published in 1848 under Cixi's father-in-law, Emperor Dowager, officials had been scandalized. They had accused him of inflating the status of foreign barbarians and heaped invective in him. He had been dismissed from his job. Now in 1865 his book reached Cixi, and she plucked him out of disgrace semi-retirement at his home on the Yellow River and promoted him to a key post in the Foreign Office. Xu's appointment was seen by Westerners in Beijing as yet another sign of the beginning of a new era. In the next few years, Xu suffered continuous insults from other officials. He begged to retire, citing poor health, and eventually Cixi had let him go. He died in 1873. After Xu's retirement, Cixi appointed an American missionary, W.A.P. Martin, to head Tongan College at the recommendation of Robert Hart. As a foreigner, Martin was spared peer group ostracism, but for Cixi to put a Western at the helm of a Chinese educational institution was groundbreaking and extremely bold. The American was chosen because he had introduced Western legal concepts to China through his translation of Henry Wetton's Elements of International Law, which was published with a subvention of 500 taels of silver from an office, authorized by Cixi. He stayed in this post for decades and trained many diplomats and other major figures. This Western-style college became a model for a new educational system in the empire. To open people's eyes to the outside world, Cixi began to send travelers overseas. In spring 1866, when Hart was going on home leave, Prince Gong selected several students from Tongan College to travel with him and tour Europe. A 63-year-old Manchu named Bin Chung was assigned to lead the small group of young men. Sporting a scholarly goatee, he became, as he proudly wrote of himself, the first person to be sent to the West from China. Bin Chung was a clerk in the customs office. For such a path-blazing mission, his rank was incredibly low, and his age far too advanced. The problem was that all who had been approached, whose rank could be no higher than Hart's in order to be in his entourage, declined to accept the job. Bin Chung was the only man who volunteered. Many alarmists warned him that going to a foreign land would be like offering himself as prey to tigers and wolves in human form, and that he could be kept a hostage or possibly chopped into pieces. But Bin Chung had a strong sense of curiosity and was remarkably free of prejudice. He had learned enough about the outside world from his Western friends, one of whom was W.A.P. Martin, to know that the scary tales were baseless. In a poem, he described how books from his foreign friends had broadened his horizon, so that he was no longer like the infamous frog that sat at the bottom of a well, declaring that the sky was as big as the patch it could see. Bin Chung traveled to 11 countries, visiting cities and palaces, museums, operas, factories and shipyards, hospitals and zoos, and met people from monarchs to the average man and woman. Queen Victoria noted down her audience with him in her diary on June 6, 1866. Receive the Chinese envoys who are here without credentials. The headman is a mandarin of first class. They look just like the wooden and painted figure one sees. Bin Chung, whose status had been vastly inflated for this meeting, wrote in his own diary that Queen Victoria asked him what he thought of Britain and that he replied, "The buildings and appliances are ingeniously constructed and made, and better than those in China. As for the way state affairs are run, there are very many advantages here," to which Queen Victoria said that she hoped that this tour would enhance the amicable relations between the two countries. At a ball given by the Prince of Wales, Bin Chung was dazzled by the dancing, which being non-existent in China, he described in some detail with obvious yearning. When the Prince of Wales asked him for his impression of London, he said frankly that, as the very first Chinese envoy abroad, he had the good fortune to be the first to know there was such a splendor across the ocean. He marveled at the illuminated cities at night, and was amazed by the trains, which he wrote on 42 times. The sensation is like flying through the air, he wrote, and he brought back home a working model train of a train. He registered that machines could improve people's lives. In Holland, the use of water pumps to create fertile fields made him reflect, if these are used on peasants' land in China, we don't have to worry about drought or waterlogging anymore. He liked European political systems and recorded with admiration his visit to the Houses of Parliament in London. I went to the great chamber of the Parliament, which has a high vault and is grand and awe-inspiring. There, 600 people who have been elected from all parts of the country gather to discuss public affairs. Different views are freely debated, and only when a consensus is reached will a decision be taken and implemented. Neither the monarch nor the Prime Minister can impose his will on any decisions. This inquisitive man was bowled over by everything he saw, even the fireworks which had been invented in his own country. But while in China there remained firecrackers on the ground, here they were fired into the sky and produced ravishing explosions. Even his reservations were prefaced by praise. Westerners love being clean, and their bathrooms and toilets are immaculately washed. The only thing is that they throw newspapers and magazines into the faces after they read them, and sometimes they use them to wipe the dirt. They don't seem to respect and treasure things that have writings on them. Respecting the written word was a Confucian teaching. Not least was Bing Chun smitten by a European woman and the fact that they could mingle with men and dance with men wearing gorgeous clothes. This kind of male-female relationship seemed to appeal to him. The way Western men treated their women particularly impressed him. On board a steamer, he noticed that women walked arm in arm with men upon the deck, or rested on rattan couches while their husbands waited upon them like servants, which was the opposite of how things were done in China, but which showed a kind of domestic intimacy that was attractive to him. He made a joint of saying that in Europe, women could be crowned monarchs just like men, one great example being Queen Victoria. About the Queen, Bing Chun wrote admiringly, "She was 18 when she succeeded to the throne, and everybody in her country sings in praise of her wisdom." Bing Chun's diaries, with her rhapsodic superlatives about the West, were delivered to Prince Gong upon his return to China, and the prince had them copied and presented to Cixi. This was the first eyewitness account that Cixi read of the outside world by one of her own officials, and it was bound to affect her deeply. In particular, the treatment of women in the West could not fail to attract her. While Western women could be monarchs in their own right, Cixi had to rule from behind her son's throne. She could not see her officials without a screen, and even with the screen she was still unable to receive foreign envoys who had been requesting an audit to present their credentials. When she sought opinions from the grandees on this matter, the response had been cast iron and uniform. The audience could not be granted while the emperor was a child. The envoys would have to wait until he formally assumed power. That she might receive the envoys was out of the question, so unthinkable that most officials did not address that possibility. It was impossible for Cixi not to be favorably disposed towards Western ways. So her response after reading Bing Chun's diary was to promote him to a post in the Foreign Office and make him Director of Western Studies at Tongan College in early 1867, when Shu, the admirer of Washington, was head of the college. The two men had been kindred spirits, and Shu had given Bing Chun a copy of his war geography to take on his journey, during which Bing Chun had confirmed that Shu was indeed right that China was not the center of the world. Shu wrote a preface to Bing Chun's diary when it was published with Cixi's endorsement. Just like Shu, Bing Chun was attracted by the conservative grandees. Grand Tutor Wang mentioned him in his diary with loathing and contempt, calling him a volunteer to be a slave of the devils. Aghast that he should refer to barbarian chieftains as monarchs, it is unclear that the pain Bing Chun endured for his broad-mindedness played any role in the deterioration of his health, which led to his death in 1871. Sending ambassadors to Western countries had always been Cixi's intention, but no suitable men could be found to fill the posts, as no official spoke a foreign language or knew anything about foreign lands. In 1867, Anson Burlingame, U.S. Minister to Beijing, was leaving his post for home, and Prince Gong suggested that Burlingame became the ambassador extraordinary to Europe and America. In his recommendation, Prince Gong told Cixi that Burlingame was a fair and conciliatory man who had the interests of China at heart, and that he was always willing to help China solve its problems. He could be trusted just like the Briton Robert Hart, with whom we have no barriers of communication. America, the prince added, was also the most peaceful and unaggressive country among the powers as far as China was concerned. Showing considerable imagination, Cixi approved the suggestion immediately and made Burlingame China's first ambassador to the West, providing him with official credentials and seals. Burlingame's brief was to present the new China to the world and explain its new foreign policy, to argue against and stop anything that is damaging to China's interest, and agree to anything that is beneficial. He would have two young Chinese deputies, Xi Gang and Su Juyao, and they should be consulted on all issues. Important decisions must be referred back to Beijing. In order that Britain and France would not feel put out, one diplomat from each country was invited to be a secretary to the mission. The conservatives were annoyed. In his diary, Grand Tutor Wang contemptuously called Burlingame a foreign barbarian chieftain, GQ. The foreign community was impressed by the idea. Singular and unexpected, wrote the English language North China Herald. The paper could not believe that the Chinese mind was capable of such an inspired initiative, and attributed it to Mr. Hart's brain. In fact, Hart was only told about it after it was conceived, and although he expressed support, his subsequent remarks were lukewarm and skeptical, if not downright critical. Perhaps he was thought of as Mr. China, who was somewhat jealous. The Burlingame mission traveled across America and Europe, attracting much attention wherever it went. It was received by the heads of all the states it visited, among them Prince Andrew Johnson in America, Queen Victoria in Britain, Napoleon III Emperor of France, Bismarck in Prussia, and Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Queen Victoria wrote in her diary on November 20, 1868, "To receive the Chinese ambassador, the first who has ever come here, but he is an American in European dress, and Mr. Burlingame. His colleagues are, however, two real Chinese, the two secretaries being English and French." Cixi could not have chosen a more suitable spokesman than Anson Burlingame. Born in New Berlin in New York in 1820, Burlingame had been appointed by President Abraham Lincoln as First Minister of China in 1861. Firm-minded and with gentle manners, Burlingame believed in the equality of nations and never looked down on the Chinese. He would represent China to Western audiences most eloquently. He was already known for his oratorical powers. After Harvard University Law School, he had entered the Massachusetts legislature as a senator, and then went into the Congress in Washington, D.C. There, in 1856, he delivered a powerful verbal thrashing of a fervent advocate of slavery, Congressman Preston Brooks, who had just savagely beaten up Senator Charles Summers, an abolitionist, with a wooden cane. Burlingame was challenged to a duel by Brooks, and he accepted, naming the rifle as his weapon of choice, and Navy Island above Niagara Falls as the place for the meeting. The duel did not take place only because Brooks refused the conditions. In Beijing, Burlingame was instrumental in getting Western countries to adopt a cooperative policy and to substitute fair diplomacy for the doctrine of force. During the trip, his passionate peace speeches on behalf of China can give links from the following address to the citizens of New York on 1868. This was how he introduced his mission. "I aver that there is no spot on this earth where there has been greater progress made within the past few years than in the Empire of China. She has expanded her trade and she has reformed her revenue system. She is changing her military and naval organizations. She has built or established a great school where modern science and the foreign languages are to be taught. She has done this under every adverse circumstance. She has done this after a great war, lasting through 13 years, a war out of which she comes with no national debt. You must remember how dense is her population. You must remember how difficult it is to introduce radical changes in such a country as that. The introduction of your own steamers threw out of employment 100,000 young men. The introduction of several hundred foreigners into the civil service embittered, of course, the ancient native employees. The establishment of a school was formidably resisted by a party led by one of the greatest men of the empire. Yet, in defiance of all this, in spite of all this, the present enlightened government of China has advanced steadily along the path of progress." Trade, Burlingame informed his audience, has in many days in China risen from $82 million to $300 million, more than 4.5 billion in today's currency. These changes were truly impressive. Burlingame reminded politicians and the public because they involve a third of the human race. Challenging those advocated coercing China into quick industrialization, he pointed out that the idea was born of their own interest and of their own caprice. He condemned those who tell you that the present dynasty must fall and that the whole structure of Chinese civilization must be overthrown. Burlingame did more than present the case for China. On behalf of the country, he signed an equal treaty with America in 1868, different from any of the unequal treaties signed between China and Western countries after the Opium War. It especially protected Chinese immigrants to America by giving them the status enjoyed by the citizens or subjects of the most favored nation, and actively tried to stop the trade in slave laborers from China to South America, which was ongoing at the time. In a 6,000-word article, Burlingame's friend and admirer, Mark Twain, vividly described the difference the treaty would make to the Chinese living in America. It affords me infinite satisfaction to call particular attention to this consul clause, and think of the howl that will go up from the cooks, the railroad draggers, and the cobblestone artists of California when they read it. They can never beat and bank and set the dogs on the Chinamen anymore. Before the treaty, the Chinese had no legal protection, as Mr. Mark Twain observed. I have seen Chinamen abused and maltreated in all the mean, cowardly ways possible to the invention of a degraded nation. But I never saw a policeman interfere in the matter, and I never saw a Chinaman right it in a court of justice for wrongs thus done to him. Now the Chinese became voters, and politicians could no longer ignore them. Twain wrote with relish, for at once sweep all the crippling, intolerant, and unconstitutional laws framed by California against Chinamen, pass away and discover 200,000 prospective Hong Kong and Suzhou voters and office holders. The Burlingame Treaty was ratified by Beijing the following year. Burlingame's deputy Xi Gang admired him for being open, understanding, fair, and for working with such dedication to the country he was now representing. When things were not going as well as he wished, Burlingame was given to inconsolable discomposure and frustration. In Russia, China's neighbor, with whom a border thousands of kilometers long boded potential trouble, the sense of responsibility seemed especially to weigh on him. Mental and physical exhaustion, for he had been on the road for 2 years, took their toll, and Burlingame fell ill the day after his audience with the Tsar, in the depths of a Russian winter. He died in St. Petersburg in early 1870. Cixi had been kept informed about this tour, and she honored and rewarded Burlingame with real feeling, before ordering Xi Gang to take over, stressing that it is of utmost importance that the mission continue. Before he left Beijing, at the beginning of 1868, Xi Gang had been summoned to an audience with the Empress Dowager, who was seated behind the yellow silk screen, while Emperor Cixi, then 11 years old, sat on a throne in front of the screen. Xi Gang went down on his knees as soon as he crossed the threshold, and taking off his mandarin hat and placing it on his left with the feather pointing towards the throne as required by etiquette, he recited the prescribed greetings to the emperor in the Manchu language, as he was Manchu himself, before touching his head on the ground. Then he straightened up, put his hat back on, stood up, moved forward to the right, to a cushion closer to the throne, where he knelt again and waited for Cixi's questions. Cixi asked him about the route of the journey, to which Xi Gang provided a list of the countries he was traveling to and through. It was clear that she had a good idea of the geography of the world, and was well informed about Western customs. She told Xi Gang to get his entourage to watch their manners, and don't let them make a fool of themselves and be laughed at by foreigners. Showing full awareness of the ostracism that her diplomats suffered at home, she said supportively to Xi Gang, "Working in foreign affairs, you have to be prepared to take all those nice remarks people make about you." At this, the young man answered, "Even Prince Gong is subject to such things, and he does not shy away. We small people can only do our utmost in our jobs." Xi Gang was a diligent official, and his diary of the trip read very differently that of the earlier traveller Bin Chung. Rather than brimming with effusive enthusiasm for the West, his view was more detached. Some things would not work in China, he believed. Autopsies, for example, horrified him, although he accepted that they served an important purpose. He felt that the children of the deceased could not possibly consent to their elders being cut up. Among the things he frowned upon were pleasurable pursuits in which men and women took part together, such as dancing, playing on the beach, swimming in the sea. The Chinese valued sense. He claimed the Europeans' sensuality. He was averse to Christianity, which he thought was a good doctrine but was hypocritical. Westerners preached the love of God and love of man, and they seemed really to believe it, and yet they waged wars with gunboats and cannons to conquer people by force, as well as imposing opium, a poison worse than the plague, on the Chinese, all for profit. It looks as though the love of God is less real than the love for profit, he wrote. And yet Cixi also recorded that in London, at Madame Tussaud's, he was surprised to see a stately life-size wax figure of Commissioner Lin, the anti-opium crusader whose destruction of opium had led to the Opium War with Britain. Here, Lin was together with his favorite consort, dressed in resplendent costumes, standing majestically in what was definitely the Hall of Fame in London. Madame Tussaud had commissioned the figures from a Cantonese artist and imported them at enormous expense. So it was far from the case that all British Christmas were enthralled to the love of profit or in favour of the opium trade. Other positive impressions range from the courtesy and hospitality of the kings and queens who entertained their mission to the kindness and friendliness of fellow park strollers. Visiting George Washington's tomb, Cixi was struck by its simplicity and paid homage to this great man. But Cixi showed that he was, on the whole, admirer of the Western political system. He described how the American Congress worked and commented, "With this system, people's wishes can be expressed at the highest level, and so the societies run fairly." Of the countries he visited, America seemed to him the most sincere in wishing to be friendly with China, not least because its immense size and rich resources meant that he had no reason to covet anything from China. France he disapproved of, for imposing heavy taxation on its people to keep a large army for overseas wars. The young official was in favor of industrialization, writing in some detail about scientific inventions and modern enterprises. He evinced particular enthusiasm for the telegraph, regarding it as something that he did not intrude on nature like the other projects, and could almost be part of nature. All in all, the Mandarin concluded, if we are able to do what they are doing, there is no question that we too can be rich and strong. Cixi and his Chinese companions returned to China at the end of 1870, having traveled to 11 countries in nearly 3 years. Their diaries and reports were presented to Cixi, and yet no action followed on from the massive amount of knowledge gained on the goodwill generated. The only move was to send groups of young teenagers to America for education. But this project, whose objective was to produce future pillars of society who really knew the Western practices, had been in the pipeline for some time. Early, who had been promoting this program, was anxious that a comprehensive agenda should be set. He was then the viceroy of Scilly, with his office in Tianjin, near the capital. In 1872 he asked to come to Beijing to see the Empress Dowager, but Cixi told him not to come. She had been in a most vulnerable position since late 1869, when some murderous events had occurred, leaving her struggling to survive and unable to launch major initiatives. Moreover, her son was about to take over, and her retire to the harem was imminent. Cixi lamented, "Unexpectedly the situation changed. Alas, there is nothing I can do with my hands."